Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so thrilled to introduce this virtual event with Alex Ross presenting his new book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, in conversation with James Wood. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. Just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of Wagnerism on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Harvard Square. So we thank you very much for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings recently, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I am so pleased to introduce our speakers. Alex Ross has been the music critic for The New Yorker since 1996. His first book, the international bestseller, The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and won a National Book Critics Circle Award. His second book, the essay collection Listen to This, received an ASCAP Deems Taylor Award. He was named a MacArthur Fellow in 2008 and a Guggenheim Fellow in 2015. James Wood is a staff writer at The New Yorker and professor of the practice of literary criticism at Harvard University. He is the author of How Fiction Works, as well as the essay collections Serious Noticing, The Broken Estate, and The Irresponsible Self, and the novels The Book Against God and Upstate. Tonight, they'll be discussing Alex Ross's new book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. This tour de force examines the outsized influence of 19th century opera composer Richard Wagner on the culture and the ideologies of the Western world. Today, and for decades, Wagner's music and rabid anti-Semitism are infamous for their impact on Adolf Hitler and Nazism. But Wagner's legacy can also be seen in the roots of many disparate movements, from modernism to the civil rights movement and even to Zionism. Ross quotes Theodor Herzl in a sentiment that has cut in so many ways throughout history that I haven't gotten it out of my head. My only rest in the evening was listening to Wagner's music. Only on the evenings when no opera was performed did I doubt the rightness of my ideas. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by Boston Wagner Society. Before we begin, I would like to introduce Dahlia Geffen, president of Boston Wagner Society, for more about the organization.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this wonderful event with Alex Ross. The Boston Wagner Society is a nonprofit organization that was created 17 years ago to enhance people's enjoyment and knowledge of Wagner's sublime operas. We're membership-based. Our membership dues are pretty low, so if you join, these are the things that you would enjoy. We have yearly concerts. We did Act 1 of Siegfried, which was semi-staged, with Met Opera singers Alan Held, bass baritone, David Cangelosi, who's a mime, is a character tenor, and Daniel Brenna, who's a Helden tenor. In addition, another exciting event was our swan boats. In case you don't know, the swan boats in the public garden were inspired by Lohengrin. And we organized an event where we went on the swan boats around the pond in the public garden. And we had a Helden tenor in one of two boats who was singing two arias from Lohengrin. Needless to say, we got a lot of attention. We also do other events besides concerts. We invite scholars, writers to give presentations. We publish our quarterly journal, Wagneriana, which is highly regarded. We, of course, offer tickets to the Bayreuth Festival. Who doesn't want to go to Bayreuth? They're very difficult to obtain, although easier now than they were in the past. But if you're a member of a society, your chances go way up. We collaborate with other music organizations. In the past, we have collaborated with New England Conservatory, Boston Conservatory at Berkeley, Opera Maine. We started collaborating with Glimmerglass Festival. However, events, the events were canceled due to COVID, perhaps in the future. Let's see. What did I forget? No, that's about it. If you would like to get a copy of our journal, here's one, the last issue. Can you see me? No?
Not with the virtual screen, really. But.
No, it doesn't work. Okay. Well, if you would like to get a free copy, please email us, bostonwagner@comcast.net, or go to bostonwagnersociety.org. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Dahlia. And now I'm so delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Alex and James.
No, thank you very much indeed for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Dahlia, for the information about the Wagner Society. And welcome everyone to this Harvard Bookstore virtual encounter between Alex and me. It's a tremendous book, Wagnerism. Nell called it a tour de force. It's a Gesamtkunstwerk indeed. It's got it's just a colossal amount in it. It follows, for those of you who have not yet had a chance to look at it, it follows what might be called the Wagner effect, a series of Wagner cults, some benign, some malign, and tracks Wagner's profound influence on movements like French symbolism. Charles Baudelaire was enormously influenced by Wagner. On European modernism, there's a tremendous discussion of Eliot's The Wasteland, Joyce, Woolf, and others. On American self-creation, an extraordinarily interesting and to me completely new discussion about Wagner's influence on the American Western via Owen Wister's The Virginian. Of course, on film music, from The Birth of a Nation to Apocalypse Now, and on fantasy. It's not an exaggeration to say that Alex proves, I think, that an enormous quantity of contemporary fantasy via Tolkien is in effect Wagner. So it's a massive book, and it's also a tremendous kind of warehouse. Although that's the wrong word, because that seems too, that's not alive enough. It's what should we say, a terrarium full of scurrying facts and details. I'm just going to share 3 or 4, and then I'm going to go straight to Alex. But I want to get them out because I think they might be missed in our conversation, and they give, I hope, a flavor of the quality of the book and its joyousness. In 1877, Wagner paid an extended visit to England, where there were a number of concerts. And Alex Ross tells us that sometimes during these concerts, Wagner sat in an armchair facing the audience while Hans Richter conducted. This is a completely bizarre idea that the audience would be looking at the composer who's looking at you in an armchair while Wagner's music was being played. George Eliot, in an 1855 article on Liszt, Wagner, and Weimar, referred to the propaganda of Wagnerism, and Ross comes in to tell us that this is one of the first appearances of that word propaganda in English. We learn about the existence of kitschy things like Siegfried schnitzels, Nibelung dumplings, and even an extraordinary thing that seems to be a Wagnerian bath that was manufactured by a German firm. We read about W.E.B. Du Bois paying a visit in 1936 of all times to Bayreuth, and very movingly writing back in a piece, a journalistic piece, that German anti-Semitism, as he puts it, surpasses in vindictive cruelty and public insult anything I've ever seen, and I have seen much. I found that extremely moving. And finally, this piquant detail that quite possibly on August the 7th, 1909, Thomas Mann and Virginia Woolf were in the same audience at Bayreuth watching Parsifal. So that's the kind of book we're dealing with, an immense treasury. And I suppose I'd like to ask you, Alex, to begin with. This took a decade of labor. As you're working through archives and working through your reading, you're discovering more and more of this kind of information. At what point did you know what kind of form you wanted the book to take, and how did you feel you had to structure all these amazing stories?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the incredibly kind words, James and Nell. It's a great honor to be conversing here with you from afar. And also I have to say, I love Harvard Bookstore. I went to Harvard and I lurked constantly in that store when I was an undergraduate, bought dozens and dozens of books, some of them no longer readable theoretical works from the 1980s, but others that are central to my library, probably a few behind me on these shelves. And so not to be able to go to just one of my favorite bookstores in the universe is a bit heartbreaking, but it's wonderful that events like this exist. And of course, I urge everyone to support Harvard Bookstore and or your local bookstore as well. But yes, in terms of the structure of the book, and I love the details that you picked out. These are some of my own. And it was just a sort of a daily routine of discovering something unaccountable and odd and amusing or faintly sinister or whatever it was, but just the sense of looking under the surface of this period. The book is really about the fin de siècle, that's sort of the central period. And somehow by following this thread, Wagner, you are led through so many unexpected and fascinating situations, and the way it connects so many different artistic fields as well. But just sort of, yeah, that social texture, the idea of Wagner sitting in the armchair looking out at the audience, which the only thing I've ever seen quite like that actually was the magnificent Jessie Norman, sort of toward the end of her career, organized a concert at Carnegie Hall, and others were performing most of the time, and she was off to the side sitting in a very nice armchair with a little table and a glass of water. So that was a fittingly Wagnerian moment from Jessie Norman, who was a great Wagner singer. But yeah, in terms of the structure, it did evolve a bit. I mean, I knew what the major emphases were going to be. I knew that Baudelaire and Mallarmé and the Symbolists and Proust and Thomas Mann and Virginia Woolf and Willa Cather and Kandinsky. There was sort of this procession of major figures that I had in mind. But my original structure was actually somewhat more thematic. I think I was going to have a chapter on Wagner and 19th century literature, Wagner and painting and the visual arts, Wagner and early modernism, then getting into the political questions, left and right, Wagner and Hollywood. And then it sort of ended up evolving more toward a roughly chronological structure. And although the book constantly is doubling back, each chapter sort of tends to go back to 1876 or the 1850s or something, especially early on. But it does sort of roughly march forward their geographical divisions early on. And that, I think, what I realized was shifting from a sort of essayistic emphasis on certain major figures to something more like a cultural history that would be this panorama that would be rolling by with the sort of the strange fascination with Wagner at the center of it, because I was discovering so much sort of more marginal material that nonetheless seemed worth holding on to at some point. And yeah, just in terms of capturing that social fabric, that cultural fabric of the fin de siècle, which was just the heyday of the religion of art, and so all of this comes back to the worship of the artist, sort of the conception of the artist as prophet and maker of a new world, and as revolutionary, and so on and so forth. And Wagner was, the chosen one, in terms of that religion of art at the turn of the last century.
It's an amazing testament to the passion that thousands, if not millions, of people felt, obviously still feel, but felt in this period for Wagner's music. But I was also struck, reading your book, by how extraordinarily ambivalent many of them were, and that this is an unusual thing, because you don't think of people. You don't think of people sort of loving Beethoven for 1 year and then hating him for the next year. Generally, it's a more stable kind of, a stable relationship one has to Bach or Beethoven or Brahms or whatever. But in your recounting, obviously there's Nietzsche, who is for and then against. Thomas Mann himself says something like, it depends on what day you catch me, right? Right. One day I feel this way, You quote Virginia Woolf. I didn't know any of this stuff, but you quoted Virginia Woolf. I did know about the Mann and Nietzsche, but Woolf, it was new to me. And you quoted her as saying, that she was completely stunned when she saw Parsifal in Bayreuth. And then 4 years later, she's saying, I can't bear it. It's sort of pretentious babbling and sentimental bawling and so on. Mm-hmm. Joyce seems to have been similarly kind of ambivalent, says that the Meistersinger is his favorite opera, and then also says it's sort of pretentious. Anyway, how do you account for that? What explains that wildness, that wild oscillation of feeling?
Well, it obviously goes back to Wagner himself, who was an incredibly complicated personality, who projected his personality out into the world in an unmistakable way, in a whole series of ways, as many artists before him did not. I mean, he was just sort of constantly advertising his own feelings and airing his own thoughts on every imaginable subject. So just sort of the sheer volume of material that he spewed out in his lifetime was just guaranteed to, I think, just set off all kinds of fires and sort of start controversies right and left. And the fact that he was constantly contradicting himself as well. So he himself would be saying one thing and the opposite a year later or 10 years later. But that's not, I mean, there's something in the work itself, which, just the words and the music, which deeply divided audiences from the start, and sort of, in the 1850s, even before Wagner's works were really being widely performed, just his ideas were enormously controversial. And those essays in the late 40s, early 50s were assaultive, provocative. They were attacking sort of established ideas of opera in every imaginable way. So that was guaranteed to set off a stink, and I think that really was the idea to begin with. But yeah, the experience of the opera. I mean, it had this power to put people under its spell, and some people enjoyed that experience of sort of being carried away into this sort of dream state. And other people found that very alarming, even as they were sort of going under. It was as if this was a dangerous experience. Vernon Lee, who's a fascinating figure, talked about that effect. And Thomas Mann, just all along, was both captivated and suspicious, of this bewitchment, of this kind of sorcery. And then that has to do with just the quality of the music, I think, is orchestration, the way it sort of generates these oral illusions, these timbres that float out and you're not quite sure which instruments are producing them, these transitions, these kind of magical transitions. It's very cinematic as well, as he abandons kind of conventional phrase structure and sort of formal structures. And so this was sort of transporting and alarming. And so that people sensed this enormous power, and the question was, how much were they going to let it, take over, and sort of this urge to fight back, and that's what I found so interesting. I think this fighting back against Wagner, this agon is a word I use very often, sort of going back to Nietzsche's conception of the sort of Greek conflict in athletics or in the arts, usually between an older and younger figure, and so that happens again and again. It's often an initial phase of infatuation, and then sort of as you grow older and you're finding your own voice, you need to reject that, and this is sort of anxiety of influence effect, certainly. But sometimes it works the other way around. Sometimes it's a initial rejection, and then sort of coming to terms later on, which was actually more of my own experience with Wagner, or just this oscillation, this constant oscillation, which Mann and Virginia Woolf both just ultimately neither could entirely make up their minds about Wagner. And but then you have people who sort of had this untroubled relationship, like Willa Cather, just loved the music, and there were certain Wagner singers whom she adored, and it wasn't fraught for her, and so that's interesting too, that some people just never felt threatened or.
That's one of the interesting things in the book is you talk about the way different national cultures dealt with and absorbed Wagner. And for the French, at least for a period of French history, Wagner was sort of progressive, revolutionary, and a number of writers and thinkers were excited by a leftism that they felt in his politics, and that he seemed at the forefront of the front of the vanguard. In Germany, which we can come to in a minute, I guess we have to at some point. But say in Britain and in America, you point out that there was less fraughtness generally. There was just less political baggage, and in some way he was almost depoliticized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it became, you tended, I think, not to find the most radical figures attaching themselves to Wagner. It became a rather more traditional kind of idealistic, at times conservative conception of how art was going to operate in the world, and how ancient myth and legend would be revived. So the fact that although Whitman takes a little bit of interest in Wagner toward the end of his life, the Wagnerians in America in the later 19th century are more people like Owen Wister, the Western novelist, or early 20th century for him. And sort of this idea of kind of the heroic, individual out in the wilderness was whether it's Siegfried or Parsifal or some other Wagner figure, could be translated into American terms. And so that's what keeps happening. Wagner is translated in a different milieu, or he's absorbed into different personalities, and he changes in the process, and so the who Wagner is fluctuates in a very interesting way for me, as this book goes on, and he almost disappears sometimes. He becomes quite distant in terms of what his music is and sort of what he had in mind. It's much more these impressions that people have that almost obscure the quote unquote reality of the work, to the extent that the work has.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about, well, if we talk briefly about the what Nazism made of Wagner. You write about how an idiosyncratic mass of beliefs and prejudices, so Wagner's contradictoriness, the writings that contradict themselves and so on, was hammered into a doctrine. Just talk briefly about how that hammering went on, and perhaps particularly you talk about the important role of this unpleasant, alas, Englishman, Houston Stewart Chamberlain.
Yeah. Well, it's so difficult to put this in a way that's precise, but also not. I never want to be sort of cutting too finely in terms of making these distinctions between Wagner's anti-Semitism and Chamberlain's anti-Semitism and Hitler's anti-Semitism. I mean, it is just a tremendous continuity, and it is sort of more or less a straight line, and just unambiguously Wagner helped to popularize a much more violent and racialized and sort of quasi-biological form of anti-Semitism that spread in especially the 1870s and into the 1880s in Germany and Austria as well, and became sort of the foundation of Nazi ideology. So that is kind of dried. But where I do sort of try to sort of draw some distinctions and just sort of show that it's just important to see the stages of the transition. I mean, anti-Semitism is not in itself a political ideology. It can be found all across the spectrum. And of course, anti-Semitism on the left was very strong in the 19th century, and you can still find it today. And Wagner began, on the left. It was sort of very much associated with the left around 1848. Aside from that, I mean, what were his politics? And just sort of, there's various pieces of evidence that point in different directions, but you can't really find a design in him for a totalitarian state. I mean, there's an element of him which is strongly anarchist, which is sort of resisting the very idea of an organized state. He's quite anti-militarist at times. At other times, he's very chauvinist, and he goes through this phase, especially with the founding of the Kaiserreich, of being a sort of enthusiastic imperialist, really, but that tends to ebb away at the end of his life, and so you're left with, it is a mess. It's a political, it's a very incoherent political picture that you find of him, and so any political appropriation of Wagner, whether on the left or on the right or in the middle or wherever, has to omit some pieces of this overcomplicated picture in terms of his politics. I think the Nazis had an easier time in terms of that retouching of Wagner for their political purposes than other groups did, because a lot of the raw material was there, and above all, this violent anti-Semitism. But Chamberlain, who is an awful but also fascinating figure, who went through this phase of being deeply involved in the French symbolists, and was a co-founder of the Revue Wagnerienne, which was almost the kind of place where French symbolism began. So quite avant-garde in his tastes, very devoted to Mallarmé. Then sort of increasingly moves toward this extreme chauvinistic German nationalism as he Germanizes himself, and his anti-Semitism, his racism becomes more and more violent.
He marries into the Wagner clan.
Yeah, and then he marries Eva Wagner, and becomes a Wagner, and becomes sort of the ideological, the intellectual guru, the resident philosopher at Bayreuth. And then in 1923, he meets Hitler and hails Hitler as the savior of Germany, comparing him to Parsifal, no less. And so, but Chamberlain himself made a very interesting remark about Wagner's ideology, and said he said exactly this. He said, Wagner is all over the place. One day he's a vegetarian, and the other day he's a sort of a rank naturalist, and he's an anti-Semite, and then he's focused on something else. And so Chamberlain found Wagner of limited use as a direct source of political ideas. Wagner was far more useful as this patriarch, this giant figure of German culture, the master myth maker of Teutonic myth. And I think that is ultimately more the role that Wagner played in Nazi Germany. And I think that's ultimately more what Wagner was for Hitler.
Right.
Less a direct source of political ideas, more as just this sort of god hovering above the scene, who could still be deeply and powerfully politicized as he plays that sort of somewhat more sort of above the fray role. In fact, I think Wagner became more politically effective once the specifics of his politics were sort of brushed aside.
Right, and you make the point actually that even in the 30s, as things acutely get going in Nazi Germany, there are Nazis who have decided that Wagner is beyond the pale. He's too decadent. He's pessimistic. He's sensual. And I think you actually also say that Wagner performances, the sort of number of Wagner performances, went down in the Nazi era, which surprised me. Yes,
Wagner was certainly ubiquitous in Nazi Germany, and he didn't, suffer in neglect in Nazi Germany by any means. But yeah, the performances did go down, even as performances of Verdi were going up. And why was that? I think, just in toto, these operas are immensely complex. They do contain a great deal of pessimism. They are tragedies. They are murky, especially, Parsifal is a deeply, I think, wonderfully murky piece. And it was problematic for the Nazis for that very reason. And this religion of compassion, that became a problem, especially once the war began. And yeah, this sort of general sense that there was something a little off about Wagner. And so a number of Nazis looked somewhat askance on Hitler's own enthusiasm for Wagner, and it was essentially something that they had to put up with, And for Goebbels, Goebbels ultimately found, popular culture and movies far more effective than these, 5-hour-long operas in terms of, cementing popular feeling or distracting the populace or whatever else he wanted to do. Just Wagner was just a bit too complicated. Certainly you could extract, Siegfried's theme and the Ride of the Valkyries, and you could put that in a newsreel, you could put that in a movie, but in toto, the operas just were a bit less useful. And and there was a rumor that Wagner was Jewish, which never went away. And Winifred Wagner, Wagner's daughter-in-law, who took over the festival after her husband Siegfried died, was infuriated and wrote a letter to Himmler begging him to somehow put a stop to this talk that there was Jewishness in the Wagner family. And going back, into the late 19th century, there were anti-Semites who hated Wagner. There were German chauvinists who disliked Wagner. They were not in the majority by any means, but it's just another sign that the sort of ideological presence of this composer was more complex than many people immediately assume. Because let's face it, the one thing that everyone knows now about Wagner is that he was Hitler's favorite composer, full stop. And so there is a little bit of an agenda in this book to push past that basic conception, show the breadth of the landscape, while never losing sight of that fact, because it is ultimately the central fact about Wagner's reception and posthumous history.
Yeah, well, look, while we're exploring the breadth of this tremendous landscape, I mean, you're an irrepressible storyteller, and it's one of the pleasures of reading this book is that on every other page there's a little story or a big story. And I wondered if you would you mentioned Willa Cather earlier, if you wouldn't mind, because some of the Willa Cather stuff was new and strange to me. and I was particularly interested, you've got a great little tale about her piano teacher. And I wondered if you would just sort of, which I think you sort of tracked that bit of information down. I think it was your discovery perhaps. So I wonder if you just set the scene and tell us about Katha's love of Wagner anyway.
Yeah. No, I'm a little proud of that because it is just kind of the explosive breaking news in this book, although I did let it slip in a New Yorker article a couple of years ago, is that I did track down the full history of Cather's childhood piano teacher, Professor Schindelmeiser, which had not been put together previously, which stopped the presses. But no, I think it is it's a sad and fascinating tale in itself. I think of an immigrant experience, of a sort of immigrant who came to this country with high hopes and then kind of gradually disappeared from sight. And Cather is the only reason that his name lingers in any form whatsoever. But in childhood, she moved from Virginia to Nebraska, to Red Cloud, Nebraska, and as she told she felt that it was just this utter shock to the senses, and it was this erasure, and it was the sense that she was being just thrown into nothingness, and she had to reinvent, but also had the opportunity to reinvent herself in that setting. But then, it turns out that the German and Swedish and Czech and all these other immigrant communities were an extraordinary source of cultural knowledge for her. And so she was exposed to Faust and to Heinrich Heine through neighbors, and she was exposed to French literature and the Czech experience. And then she encountered this man, Schindelmeiser, whom she used as a prototype, really very directly based the character of Professor Wunsch in The Song of the Lark on this man. And he was just briefly in Red Cloud. He floated from one place to another. He came to the United States in the 1860s, and he was in Wisconsin, he was in Kansas, he was in Nebraska, he went back to Kansas, he was in Missouri.
His father had conducted Wagner in
yeah, but this is the thing. This man who happens to show up in this little town in Nebraska was the son of a fairly well-known composer and conductor, Louis Schindelmeiser, who knew Wagner very well. He was one of the early Wagner proponents. After Wagner went into exile in 1849, Schindelmeiser was one of those foremost list, but there were a number of others who kept Wagner's name alive and performed his pieces. And although his son would not have been able to meet Wagner, I think, because of the exile, he probably met Liszt. And actually, there's a moment in The Song of the Lark where Wunsch is remembering Liszt. And so I think Heather kind of got this amazing glimpse, of the old world, and specifically of sort of this grand aspect of European musical culture through this man who just sort of showed up and then disappeared. And he was obviously an alcoholic, and he just could never hold a job for more than a year or two. And he seems to sort of go down. First he's a professor, and then he ends up as a piano tuner, and he sort of disappears in Nashville. And I can never find a time and place of death. But I loved this sort of detour, when you're working on a book like this, making a surprising little discovery, and the whole kind of world opens up. Schindelmeiser, the adventures of Professor Schindelmeiser. But it does for Cather, I think it shows, this is how Wagner came to her, with books on the shelves of her neighbors, and perhaps Schindelmeiser talking about his father and these other sort of traces, and it blends with the landscape for her. She always associates Wagner with the wide open landscape and sort of craggy masses of rock and kind of solitary figures standing at the top, and it's a very kind of pure, ahistorical kind of sense of what Wagner was about, and remains so, I think, to the end.
Yeah. And you also, I think, make a good case for there being quite a shadow of Parsifal on Death Comes for the Archbishop.
Yeah, a couple of scholars have worked on that, and it does seem to be hovering there in the background, although she didn't really leave traces, as she did with One of Ours. We know that she was thinking about Parsifal with One of Ours, but yeah, I think later on she wanted to create a kind of fable in a sort of quasi-medieval mode, and for that sort of modern telling of an old fable, you know, Parsifal was a great model for her.
Right.
A great model.
And before we go to questions, and people should feel free to write questions in. A less cheerful tale, but I was also caught by this little glimpse of a life, and that's Sabina Spielrein, who you're talking about Wagner in relation to Freud, psychoanalysis, death drive, eros, and so on, Liebestod, and you mentioned this woman Sabina Spielrein, who wrote a brilliant study of Wagnerian sexuality. And I wonder if you just say a few words about that, because I was really struck by her. She sort of passed through your book and then passed out of your book, like something in W.G. Sebald.
Yeah, she was rather new to me, I have to say, when I started exploring that subject. But I think some people might know her as a figure who appears in the film A Most Dangerous Method, which was also a title of a nonfiction book about this relationship between her and Carl Jung, who she was initially treated by Jung, and then there was an affair, but she was also studying with Jung. It was a very complicated relationship, and she emerged as an important psychoanalytic thinker in her own right, and Freud was sort of hovering there. He played this odd kind of mediating role in this relationship. But she was, of course, the only major female figure in that early circle of psychoanalysis. And I thought it was especially important, coming at the end of a chapter, I'm talking about gender and sexuality, to have the sort of female analytical perspective on these matters, and not having it always be refracted through the male lens. And so, you know, the Wagner operas were kind of a wonderful playground for psychoanalytic, sort of the literary aspect of psychoanalysis, which some people would think was the only ultimately fruitful aspect of the whole endeavor. But the incestuous relationships in The Ring, the death drive in Tristan und Isolde, Tannhäuser torn between the sensual and the chaste, and so it's just these archetypes. And Freud knew Wagner, no question, even if he barely mentioned him. Jung wrote quite directly about Wagner in various stages of his career, but so did Spielrein. And she, I think, had a bit less apocalyptic reading. And when she talked about the death drive and Freud's concept of the death drive was in fact influenced by her. It was more a metaphorical sense of, I think, of how, in a love affair, each individual is dying, as a new unit is being formed, and so it's sort of a bit less of sort of the standard fin de siècle kind of utterly morbid reading of these kinds of situations, which was, the Liebestod, the so-called Liebestod, the ending of Tristan, was treated in a way that I think Wagner did not intend, as this festival of sort of going down into the mire and embracing death, as sort of moving into the area of Lustmord, and D'Annunzio created this horrible scenario out of the Liebestod. As sort of, his version of it is a murder suicide. but yeah, so it was just more. I think it's a very nuanced and kind of more modern, reading of that concept that she puts forward, as well as I think a beautiful reading of Tristan itself. But her tale is tragic in that she ended up back in Russia, where she was originally from. She was Russian Jewish, and she was in Rostov-on-Don during the German invasion of 1941, and she didn't leave. And one reason she didn't leave, she would tell friends that these atrocities that are being attributed to the Germans, she just couldn't believe that it was happening. She had this veneration for German culture, for Wagner, and she just thought it was wild exaggerations. And so her tragedy is that she did not flee because of that belief that the Germans couldn't possibly have been bad, as everyone said. So it's a sad story, but I'm glad that she's really being revived and sort of taken much more seriously now as an analyst and as a thinker. And right. I was very gratified to discover that she had also written beautifully and very interestingly about Wagner, so she could find a place in my book.
I was very taken with that whole passage indeed. I'm going to read to you. We've got a number of questions. Apologies to the audience if I can't take all of them. This is a question from Carol Court, who asks, what do young Germans feel about Wagner today, given that the younger generation generally has turned against anything that Hitler used or emulated?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I'd hesitate to generalize too much, having not spent a huge amount of time with the younger Germans. But I mean, there was a strong reaction that sort of began back, I think, really in the 1970s and 1980s as a deeper understanding, awareness of the Holocaust, especially, sank in Germany. Wagner, who had reappeared in the 1950s and 1960s, thanks especially to the brilliance of Wieland Wagner, the grandson, directing Wagner at Bayreuth in a very fresh way, which seemed to denazify the operas, which is not quite what was going on, but that's sort of another matter. And there was a lot of concentration on sort of reviving the leftist Wagner, and in East Germany, directors were beginning to present these explicitly politicized readings of the Wagner operas. So that sort of project of renovation of Wagner was proceeding. But then I think there was a turn in the 1970s and 1980s and a much more skeptical attitude toward Wagner, and a sense that he had played a more important role in the inception of Nazi ideology than a lot of the reformed Wagnerians of the period were willing to admit. So I think it's sort of probably more that it would have been the sort of the 68 generation would have had a lot of them would have had a pronounced skepticism toward Wagner, as well as sort of the triumph of popular culture, meaning that he was just sort of less of a magic name to throw around. I think today, I mean, I see a lot of younger people at Wagner productions in Germany, not necessarily Bayreuth, which is quite expensive to go to and not something that many young people will have available, but in Munich or Berlin, I think there is a fairly avid interest in the subject. So I'm not sure that there's some kind of further rejection that's taking place. I mean, some younger, even quite progressive people might be willing to take a second, third, fourth look at this figure and see if something new could be discovered.
Here's an interesting question from Walter Bostian. I'm often struck by the realization that I've without question heard more start to finish full orchestra performances of Wagner's operas than he himself ever did, let alone any of the 19th century enthusiasts discussed here. Had these enthusiasts had the same ability to listen to again and again to the music, do you think they would have used Wagner as less of a blank canvas for their own predilections?
That's a very interesting question. Something I almost wish I'd taken up as a theme in my book, because for so many people, it would be a sort of a brief, perhaps happenstance encounter with Wagner. This magical music appears and then disappears, and they're left frantically wondering, what was that, and how can I hear it again, and what can I make of it? And meanwhile, in the memory, it grows into something sort of titanic, and also something very much which is sort of springing from their own imagination, rather than, you know, a sort of page by page experience of the score. And so I think of was it not Chamfleury, Gasparini, Augusto Gasparini, heard the wedding march from Lohengrin at a spa in Baden-Baden, and said he was utterly overwhelmed. He was penetrated. He was invaded by this extraordinary music, which seems to us, you know, quite absurd. Like the wedding march, really? You know, you could think it would be the Prelude to Tristan or something else, you know, could have that effect. But the wedding march, I don't know. But it was you know, it could have that kind of effect. And I also think of, you know, the little phrase in Proust, and this snippet of music which invades the consciousness of Charles Swann, and he hears it once and doesn't hear it again for many years, and then he does hear it again, and this sort of this world of memory as well as sort of possibility opens up, and so those kinds of experience, the music being overheard in a salon, sort of being played on a piano while you're walking by. You know, Nietzsche talks about hearing Wagner himself play a phrase over and over again on the piano when he goes to Triebschen for the first time to have his one-on-one with Wagner. Right. So that's a absolutely fascinating question. You know, absent that kind of saturation, the imagination has more room to play and can assert itself more strongly. And perhaps we're just we're too trapped by the literal fact of the ubiquity of the music and the instant availability of the music to sort of let our minds play upon it in the same way. So thank you. I wish I'd put that in the book.
That's a great question. Here is an anonymous attendee asking Alex the following. You wrote in The Rest is Noise that classical music has surprisingly and increasingly become the province/narrative of gay men. I'm paraphrasing. That's the person says, I'm paraphrasing. In your talk, you've cited several notable LGBT fans of Wagner, Cather, Wolff, Proust, Whitman et al. How does Wagner factor into this trajectory? Did the LGBT community embrace Wagner pre-Third Reich in a manner similar to many in the Jewish community did, overlooking the hatred and loving the music/spectacle? How has the LGBT community reacted post-World War II to the identification of Wagner with the Nazis?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of this in the book. It's a topic that fascinated me in particular, being gay, having pondered these questions from a fairly early stage of, you know, how does opera in general, of course, have an exceptional appeal for gay men and lesbians, and this composer in particular had a history of playing an outsized symbolic role. There's a brilliant book on the subject, Wagner and the Erotic Impulse by Lawrence Dreyfus, which goes into this at some length, and some other scholars have done so as well. But there was, I think, still more territory to be explored that I went into in this book. So I think what happens is that Wagner himself becomes, he's seen as an ally at a very early stage, an ally of sort of emergent gay identity. And at times, even more than ally, I think people sort of mistook him for being gay or sort of homoerotically inclined himself, especially when the letters between King Ludwig II and Wagner were published, and they are very flowery and romantic. And there's this is sort of rather unexpected. This is just how letters were written in the period to some extent, and there's this particular kind of worship going on back and forth. But I don't think it had much to do with sexuality, between the two of them. But it came off that way, and Ludwig's gayness was well known at an early date. And then there were some moments in Wagner's writings where he seemed to be casting a sympathetic eye on those who were attracted to their own sex. And it turns out this was really the case. I mean, there's a remarkable comment that Cosima Wagner reported in her diary, where Wagner, they're talking about a friend of theirs, the painter and designer Paul von Mukowski, who designed the sets for Parsifal, the first production of Parsifal. And he was showing up with his Italian lover. And Cosima makes a comment to the effect of this ridiculous, this is so silly. And Wagner seems to say, no. And he says that this is something for which I have understanding, but no personal inclination. And it's a very progressive thing to say, of course, for the period. So this is at least one area where Wagner is less hateful than many other people of his time. But people picked up on that, and Bayreuth became a kind of haven for gay men and lesbians. It was just known to be a place where you could sort of be a little more yourself and a little more open, and there wouldn't be any problem. And there were Wagner's son Siegfried himself was gay, and he always had a sort of entourage around him. So yeah, this theme develops of gay men and lesbians identifying with Wagner, and so I have a chapter in the book where I go into that in considerable detail. Especially with Thomas Mann and also Vernon Lee and Henry James, who has a somewhat different relationship with Wagner, and a few others, Natalie Barney, even Gertrude Stein, very, very briefly. And then later on, I get into the post-war, and then Willa Cather. I think it's quite important with Willa Cather and the worship of the veneration of this outsized, somewhat androgynous, very powerful female figure, the Valkyrie, and the singers who embody those roles. And then after World War II, it gets quite complicated in terms of Wagner and gay sexuality and the Nazi link. For many people, of course, that's supremely alienating. For a few others, it becomes a kind of sort of sick fascination, and sort of this fascinating fascism sort of mode of eroticizing this kind of sadistic Nazi male figure, and you find a bit of that in Visconti, in Salvador Dali, and a couple of others. So, as usual, it's complicated and sort of difficult to generalize about, but this is a very rich, strong tradition, I think, which remains very much alive today. This something in Wagner exceptionally speaks to those of us of that ilk. And I loved following that thread through the book.
We might have time for one more final question. There's a question from Lloyd Schwartz is asking, what do you think is the most successful use of Wagner in film?
Aha. Hello, Lloyd Schwartz, brilliant critic. There are two, I think, outstanding examples that immediately come to mind. Well, of course, there's Apocalypse Now, but that's boring. Everyone knows Apocalypse Now. It's a magnificent kind of wedding of sound and image, but I'll sort of highlight another example, which is much less well known. There's this wonderful film noir by Robert Siodmak from the 1940s, Christmas Holiday, starring Deanna Durbin and Gene Kelly, cast rather against type. It's a noir, and Gene Kelly is a very ne'er-do-well character, and Deanna Durbin is a woman who's sort of somewhat, unfortunately, drawn to him. But there's this incredible scene where they meet at an orchestral concert, and the prelude to Tristan, no, the ending of Tristan is playing, and it's just magnificently filmed, and they had a live orchestra at the old Philharmonic Auditorium in Los Angeles. They appear to have filled the whole theater with a real audience, and it's unbroken. And the camera sort of begins on stage, and then it slowly pans up to these two strangers sitting next to one another who strike up a conversation. When the music is over, they sort of bump into each other and start talking. And it's Deanna Durbin and Gene Kelly. And their faces as they're listening, and the loneliness and kind of longing in different ways in each character as the music plays. It's very powerful. It's one of the great, Wagner scenes, I think, just 2 or 3 minutes in film or literature. The other one I'll mention is Terrence Malick, The New World, the beginning of The New World. This is the story of Jamestown and Pocahontas. And the movie begins with the Native American community in its sort of idle, before the colonists, before the invaders arrive. And you see 3 female figures swimming in the water, and the Prelude to Rheingold is playing. And it's so absolutely apt on a number of different levels, literally 3 Rhine maidens, 3 figures in the water, the primordial worlds, the innocent worlds before the gold is taken from the Rhine, this sort of environmental layer of, sort of the destruction of the natural landscape. It's just, in that kind of deeper sort of thematic philosophical way, I think that might be the most extraordinary use of Wagner that I know. So Terrence Malick is at the very end of the book and presents Wagnerism for me in a very fresh, new key, to use a slightly hackneyed metaphor.
I think that's an excellent place to end. So thank you. I'm sorry I didn't get to all. We had 15 questions, I think. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but by any means. But thank you all for attending. And Alex, thank you for this extraordinary book. I hope that many of you here tonight will go and read it.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much. This was an utter delight.
Real pleasure.
Thanks so much to both of you for this conversation. Thank you to all of you who are at home and spending your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase copies of Wagnerism at harvard.com. I posted the link. Oh, I'm not a mirror. I posted the link in the chat. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, have a wonderful night. Keep reading. Please stay safe. And thank you so much again, Alex and James.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Till we meet again.
Good luck on the road. Yeah, good luck on the road. And I hope, I hope I'll actually see you in the flesh at some point.
Absolutely. May we all. Thank you. Thank you again.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.